Okay, welcome to the second module. I'm going to be quick to keep this under 15 minutes. So our vocabulary word for the day is imprimatur. I like to think of it as a stamp of approval, right? As the imprimatur means a person or an organization sanctioning something or giving a stamp of approval to a certain practice or viewpoint. So it's commonly seen in legal discussions related to religion in public schools. Some people argue, for example, that if schools allow a Christian prayer before a football game, that it gives the impression of the stamp of approval or the school's imprimatur. So this will be a useful term as we look at some topics specifically related to religion. And as you saw in your readings, the law cases aren't always consistent, and that makes it hard as an administrator to know where you should stand. So we'll spend some time breaking this down, hopefully make it a little easier to follow. So one thing I want to point out is that a lot of towns and individuals feel like it's okay to say, these are our values, the school should mimic our values, it should be majority rule, or that we should just go on past practice, right? We've always done it this way. But these stances simply are not supported by the courts, and they're not supported by the Constitution either, that says public entities are arms of the government, right? We're agents of the state working in schools, and it's important for the government to follow the Constitution and the First Amendment. So the First Amendment has two parts that are really pertinent and relative to this conversation, and they are the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Again, both of the First Amendment. So the Establishment Clause says that the government can't be seen as establishing or supporting religion, especially not one over another. But it also can't limit freedoms under the Constitution, under the First Amendment either. So you can see why this is a little tricky, because the two clauses, they push against each other, right? Religion in schools has become more controversial as of late. As you notice, our society becomes more diverse and people are trying to hold on to their Christianity, right? And it's also interesting to study this in a place like Georgia, for example, because many of the cases emerge from the Bible Belt and the 5th and the 11th Circuit Courts, which you read about, the 11th Circuit Court in your book. So you'll often hear people say that prayer has been taken out of schools, but that's really not exactly true. Students have the right to pray, and they can express their beliefs as pretty much as they always have. Really, the difference is that schools cannot be involved in sanctioning or giving that imprimatur or leading any religious activity. So let's look at students specifically. For example, if they want to pray at school, as long as they're not interrupting an educational activity or breaking a rule, then schools have that right. Students have that right, right? So for example, a student can't stand on a box and shout scripture down the hall. They can't say, I'm not going to take this test right now because I'm praying, right? But they can pray at lunch. They can even pray out loud because students are allowed to talk during lunch. They also have the right, students, to wear religious clothing and express their religious views. They can carry a Bible. They can distribute materials related to their religious beliefs. We'll talk more about that later, to people who are willing to take them. But where courts have been super clear is that schools cannot lead prayer in any way or appear to sanction prayer. Students have a lot of religious freedoms, as you see, but you'll notice probably some controversies that came out of the 11th Circuit Court in your reading, right? That kind of contradicted some of what you've read, and that's the prayer at graduation, and that students can lead the prayer. But I really want to caution you about this ruling, because this ruling was challenged by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court wouldn't hear it because they'd already ruled on this in their landmark Santa Fe case. So what they did as the Supreme Court was they told the 11th Circuit Court to reconsider their ruling and to revisit it and to follow the precedent they had set, which the 11th Circuit Court is not doing. So, should this be challenged in court? It's likely that it won't be supported because the courts really have clearly ruled, the highest court, that you can't hold people, a captive audience, to your religious beliefs. And I know the argument is that well, this isn't really a captive audience because this is graduation and graduation is optional. But do we really want students to have to make that choice? And let's flip this around. I did this a lot with my students in Georgia because this is the Bible Belt in Georgia, right? And this is where they believe students should be able to pray, or they should be able to pray. But the law specifically reads that the valedictorian can choose the prayer. So what if the valedictorian were Muslim and chose a Muslim prayer? When I asked it that way, they would say, oh, well, they shouldn't be able to then because it's imposing their views on us, right? So why is it okay to do it the other way around? Would it be okay to ask all of the Christian students then to opt out of graduation? Another interesting area in Georgia, right, that's been litigated recently is the prayer at the football games. Again, though, I asked you to think about this idea of a captive audience and to think back to our vocabulary word of imprimatur of the state, giving the imprimatur that the school agency supports prayer and promotes a particular type of religion over another is not legally defensible. Remember, students have a great deal of religious freedoms, and employees have very few religious freedoms because they are government employees. They are an arm of the state. They represent the state. So they can't, for example, participate in a religious club at school. They may be assigned to oversee that club and the safety of the students. For example, they make sure the students get on the bus, right? Make sure announcements are put up on the loudspeaker. But they can't participate in any way in this club because they can't be seen as supporting one religion over another. They also can't wear religious garb unless it's like a hijab, which would be, and that religion is seen as improper, not to wear your hijab in public if you're female, right? They can't carry a Bible. They can't put a cross on their door. They can't have religious symbols in their classroom. All these things would give the imprimatur that the school supports one religion over another. Now, they could wear minimal jewelry, like a small cross necklace. As a government employer, they could put a sticker on their car. Minimal things like that are okay. But while employees are at school or at school events, they are government agents and they need to be neutral on religion. The other thing is that this extends to email. You cannot sign an email with any sort of religious connotation, like a Bible verse. So, now let's move on to the use of facilities. An open forum, I guess we need to think about when do we allow a religious group to use our facility, and this really hinges on whether or not you have an open or a limited forum or a closed forum. So a closed forum, it's pretty clear, nobody can use the school. Schools don't generally do that, right? Because we're trying to be friendly and get taxpayer dollars, right? So an open forum is when we allow student groups or the public or public group to use our facilities. And a limited open forum might be, for example, like when we only allow student groups to use our facilities, right? But in either case, the rule's really simple. If you allow any outside groups of any kind to use your facility, you have to allow religious groups to use your facility so that you can be content neutral in your application of the policy, right? And so long as you're not allowing them to do it for religious services. So there are two caveats. The first one is that if a group is advocating illegal activity or they're promoting hate speech, you don't have to allow them to do that. So if they're not in line with your school mission, in other words, you can't, so if they're not in line with your school mission, you can tell them they can't use their facility. But if they are, you can't just say, for example, I'm not going to allow the Gay Straight Alliance because we don't personally believe in that. We don't value that here. Our community doesn't value it. It has to be really an illegal activity or something like the Ku Klux Klan that's promoting hate, skinheads, or white supremacy, those sorts of things, right? Otherwise, you have to allow the groups to use it. The other caveat that the book really doesn't talk about is that as an administrator, you always can control for time, place, and manner. Time, place, and manner. So you could say, for example, groups are all finished by 5 o'clock, or groups can't use X, Y, and Z rooms, or that there must be a custodian, right, on duty at all times. And groups have to make monetary compensation for that. But what you can't do is you can't say, I'm going to make these announcements for this group, but I'm not making the announcements for the other group. Or I'm going to send these flyers home, but I'm not going to send those flyers home. Or I'll allow the flyers to be available at the counter for this group, but not for others, right? It's really important that what you remember here is that whatever you do for one group is what you have to do for all groups. So however it is that you choose to limit time, place, and manner, and I suggest that it be written in a policy and followed. For one group, you have to limit it the same way for all groups. And this applies to the distribution of religious materials that I mentioned earlier. So let's say you allow the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts or the YMCA or a sports team to distribute materials at school, then students can also distribute materials, religious materials at school, right? But again, time, place, and manner can be controlled for. You can say you're not distributing these during class. Or you can say, I'm only going to allow the flyers to be handed out in the office, or for students to come by and get them, or to be handed outside at school or during lunchtime. Distribution of materials, just like school facilities, allows you to control for time, place, and manner, and you must do it the same for every group. So let's look at curriculum and school boards and boards of education, as they have rights to establish curriculum, and talk about that, because as you know, parents don't have the rights to just come in and say, I want the curriculum changed because this doesn't align with my religious belief. Some schools have policies, as I've said, that allow parents or guardians to have their students opt out of certain lessons, but the parents or guardians don't have the right to change the lessons or and demand that change for all students. The courts are really clear that parents and guardians don't have the right to remove certain books from the library, as we talked about before either. So books that don't conform to their religious beliefs can't be barred, right? Remember, it goes back to the idea of a marketplace of ideas, right? Where kids have options to hear lots of ideas and lots of concepts, and there's lots of availability of different viewpoints. So I also want to be clear that the Bible can be used in a historical context, right, as a historical document, as long as you're not proselytizing. And you can also hold school concerts that have some religious material, some religious music, as long as it has an educational purpose and as long as you're not proselytizing or giving the imprimatur that the school is holding this concert, you know, a Christmas concert to celebrate a particular religion over another. So when we have our holiday concerts, we have to be really careful about what's in it and how we promote it. So always have a mix of music represented at your concerts to help avoid this kind of problem. Schools also have to bear in mind that they have to allow their employees and their students time off for bona fide religious activities or holidays. And some people may need days off to celebrate religious holidays, or students may need time to get out of class for, say, catechism lessons. And school districts usually have a policy about this, about how long you can be gone and how many days a student can miss. But employers cannot deny a bona fide religious activity. School employees have the right to participate, so remember that. Another thing that comes up frequently is students talking in class about their religion. So if I were to assign a persuasive essay and you're trying to persuade me, you decide as a student, you want to persuade me that Christianity is the best religion that there is, right? That's permissible if the student's giving the paper to me as the teacher, right, to have this persuasive essay, because I'm the only one reading it. However, I'd really caution you about allowing students to stand up in front of a captive audience and read it aloud, right? If you have a captive audience and you have one student reading something that's full of religious content, right? You could have that student go home and say, wow, I had to sit through a student speech about why Christianity is the best. Well, that's a captive audience, and you wouldn't be on solid legal ground there. So finally, I just want to make a quick comment about parochial schools. Some of you may never face this, but just in case you do, there's times in which we want our money to go to parochial schools from the standpoint that schools benefit, right? Some places it's in our best interest for them to survive and thrive, as schools are at capacity and they don't have the opportunity to build new schools. But as you know, there's recent rulings that say as long as the money's going to the student and benefiting them directly, it's okay. So to wrap up, I just advocate that best practice is to follow the law, not what's always been done necessarily, right? And it's not about community values. And if you do have to implement changes, think about how you can do it to get you to the end point, but maybe in small steps so they don't get fired on the first day. Okay, I look forward to seeing you in the next module. And remember, always advocate under the law and challenge the status quo.